The contraction hit me at 4:47 in the morning alone, in an apartment with peeling paint and a landlord who'd already taped a notice to my door. I remember counting the minutes between pains because counting was the only thing keeping me from screaming. I remember gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, driving myself to St. Aurelia's Medical Center because there was no one else to call. Not my mother who'd passed 4 years earlier. Not a sister, I never had one. And not Rowan Ashcombe, the man whose name was still legally attached to mine, who had told me 3 months earlier that I was, in his exact words, not his responsibility anymore. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not his responsibility. The woman carrying his son. I made it to the hospital 40 minutes before Silas was born. A nurse asked if there was an emergency contact, and I remember the silence that followed when I said no. Just me. She squeezed my hand once, quietly, like she understood exactly how much that silence weighed, and told me she'd stay until someone from the on-call team arrived. And then 20 minutes after my son took his first breath, Dr. Malcolm Reyes, a man who had delivered probably 1,000 babies in his career, a man whose calm bedside manner had gotten me through the worst hour of labor without falling apart completely, went quiet while examining him. Too quiet. I watched his expression shift from routine calm to something careful, almost guarded, the kind of look you give a puzzle piece that doesn't belong to the picture in front of you, no matter how many times you turn it over in your hands. He didn't say congratulations. He said, "Give me a moment. I want to review something before I say anything." I was too drained to process it. My body had just spent 12 hours trying to survive itself. I remember thinking maybe I'd misread his face. But when he looked up at me again, his hands weren't quite steady, and he asked me a question that didn't make sense at the time. "Mrs. Ashcombe, has anyone on your side of the family ever had a bleeding or clotting disorder? Anything unusual with bruising, or a distinctive birthmark pattern?" I need to back up because none of this makes sense without knowing where it started. I met Rowan Ashcombe 3 years before that morning, at a fundraising dinner I'd only attended because my firm needed someone to represent the audit team. I wasn't looking for anyone. I'd spent the 2 years before that focused entirely on rebuilding a life I'd once thought would look different. A modest apartment, a stable job, quiet evenings that belonged only to me. Rowan found me by the drinks table, made some comment about the terrible band the event had hired, and made me laugh for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. He was easy to be around in the beginning. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered small details, how I took my coffee, which side of the bed I preferred once we moved in together, the exact date of my mother's passing, and he never once forgot to acknowledge it. Looking back now, I understand how those small kindnesses bought him years of benefit of the doubt, how a man can build an entire reputation for thoughtfulness out of details that cost him nothing. We married a year later, in a small courthouse ceremony his mother, Beatrix Sorrell, had reluctantly attended. She stood near the back the entire time, arms folded, offering congratulations that felt more like a formality than a blessing. She'd made it clear from our very first dinner together that she didn't think I belonged in her son's life. I came from a working background, years as a contract auditor for a downtown law firm before switching to freelance bookkeeping so I could eventually be home more, plan a family, build something slower and steadier than the 60-hour weeks I'd grown used to. Beatrix came from old money and older opinions. To her, I was a woman who'd married up and should be grateful every single day for the privilege of it. I was grateful for Rowan at least, for I thought I was. He was charming in the way men who've never been told no are charming. Smooth, confident, generous with compliments and stingy with follow-through. For the first year I told myself the distance I sometimes felt was normal marriage adjustment. He worked long hours. He traveled for what he called family business, always vague about what that actually meant, always deflecting with a joke whenever I asked for specifics. Beatrix controlled the family's finances through a trust that funded almost everything. The house, the cars, Rowan's entire lifestyle. And I slowly understood that questioning any of it was treated as an insult to the family's generosity, a debt I was expected to repay with silence. There were nights I'd catch Rowan on the phone in another room, voice low, ending the call the moment he noticed me in the doorway. I told myself it was work. I wanted badly for it to be work. By the second year I stopped telling myself anything because I was pregnant and pregnant women don't get to fall apart. The papers landed on our dining table on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd made soup that night, and it went cold while Rowan explained without once raising his voice that he wanted a divorce. Beatrix stood behind him, arms crossed, watching the whole thing like she was supervising a business transaction she'd personally orchestrated. Which I'd later learn she had. "I'm pregnant," I said because it felt like the only fact in the room that mattered. Rowan didn't even look up from his phone. "That's unfortunate timing." Unfortunate timing. Like I'd scheduled it to inconvenience him. Beatrix stepped forward with that same cool smile she always wore, the one that never reached her eyes. "Don't paint yourself as a victim here, Odalys. Men like my son don't get trapped by women who conveniently get pregnant right when a marriage is ending." Something in me went very quiet and very cold. "I never wanted anything from either of you." "No," she said. "You just like living off it." Within the week, my joint account access was frozen. My health insurance was quietly cancelled. I found out at a pharmacy counter holding prenatal vitamins I suddenly couldn't afford, my card declining in front of a line of strangers. And somewhere in that same week, a rumor started making its way through our social circle. That I'd been unfaithful, that the baby might not even be Rowan's. A lie doesn't need proof. His needs a head start. Friends who danced at our wedding stopped texting back. A woman I'd considered a close friend saw me in a grocery store and turned her card around rather than say hello. I understood, in a strange and painful way, exactly how fast a reputation can be dismantled by someone with money and no conscience. There was only one person who didn't disappear. Marisol, a former coworker from my auditing days, the kind of friend who calls just to check on you and means it. She was the one who convinced me not to simply survive quietly, but to protect myself properly. "You know what this looks like," she told me over the phone one night while I sat on my bathroom floor because it was the only room with a working heater. "You know what Beatrix does to people who threaten that trust of hers. Don't just survive this, Odalys. Document it." So I did the only thing left to do. I worked and I watched and I kept records of everything. I cleaned office suites after midnight, 3 nights a week, pushing a cart down empty hallways with my hand pressed to the small of my back. I picked up freelance transcript editing before sunrise, squinting at a laptop screen propped on a stack of books because my kitchen table had been part of the furniture Rowan reclaimed. I folded linens at a hotel laundry service until my ankles swelled past the point of comfort, until a coworker half my age started quietly taking the heavier bins from my hands without a word, just a nod, like she understood something I hadn't said out loud. There was a night 6 months along when I sat on the floor of my apartment counting coins from a jar to cover a copay, watching the numbers add up too slowly, and I let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes, because that was all the time I could afford to spend on falling apart. I remember thinking, absurdly, that even my grief had to run on a schedule now. Then I got up, washed my face and went back to the spreadsheet I'd started keeping. Dates, amounts, screenshots, timestamps. Every dollar I earned went toward rent, toward prenatal visits I now had to pay out of pocket, and toward something else. Something hidden beneath the false bottom of an old filing box in my closet. Because here's what Rowan and Beatrix never accounted for. Before I became just his wife, I spent 6 years as a forensic adjacent auditor. I know what financial irregularities look like when they're dressed up in nice language. And when Rowan cut off my access to our shared accounts, he made one mistake. He forgot I still had login credentials to an old joint cloud folder we'd never fully closed out. Inside it, wire transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Invoices from a shell consulting company that did no visible consulting. And a string of emails between Rowan and his mother discussing in language so casual it made my skin crawl, how they planned to wait her out financially, until I had no choice but to walk away from any custody claim. There was one email that stopped me cold. Beatrix, writing to Rowan, mentioned something about not repeating what happened with your sister's situation. I didn't know Rowan had a sister. He told me he was an only child. I saved that email separately in a folder of its own without knowing yet what it meant. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry in front of them again. I copied everything, saved it in 3 separate places, sent a backup to Marisol for safekeeping, and kept working double shifts while carrying a baby I was determined to bring into a life better than the one they were trying to pressure me into. Which brings us back to that hospital room, to Dr. Reyes standing over my newborn son, asking about family medical history in a tone far too careful for a routine question. "Nothing that I know of," I told him honestly. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked a nurse to pull something from the system, an older file he said from years back. I assumed it was procedure. I didn't know it would change everything. Before he could say more, the door opened. Rowan walked in. He hadn't been in the delivery room. He hadn't answered a single call during 12 hours of labor. But somehow, the second there was a healthy baby to be seen holding, he walked in wearing his good coat and an easy, practiced smile, the kind he used for people whose opinion mattered to him. "There's my boy," he said, reaching for Silas like he had any right to that moment. Dr. Reyes stepped back, not aggressively but deliberately, putting a small but unmistakable distance between Rowan and my son. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said carefully, "I'd recommend genetic counseling for the family, sooner rather than later. Your son has a marker I'd like a specialist to look at more closely." That was all he said. No explanations, no accusations. Just a professional recommendation and a look he gave Rowan that lasted a beat too long. I watched something flicker across Rowan's face in that moment. Not confusion but recognition. A man caught off guard by a truth he thought he'd buried. I didn't understand the weight of that moment until much later. Dr. Reyes noticed a rare vascular birthmark together with abnormal clotting signs. And because he'd spent years in hereditary hematology before moving into general obstetrics, the combination was enough for him to recommend genetic testing right away. It's a marker that runs almost exclusively through one specific parental line, and it comes with a documented family pattern wherever it appears. What Dr. Reyes couldn't tell me that day, because it wasn't his information to share, was that he recognized the pattern from somewhere else entirely. Years earlier in his private practice, he treated a patient for a fertility-related consultation where this exact marker had come up in a genetic screening. He couldn't confirm anything to me directly. Doctor-patient confidentiality meant Rowan's own medical history wasn't his to disclose, not even to me. All he could ethically do was flag it, recommend follow-up testing, and document what he observed in Silas's official chart, plainly, factually, without speculation. That single documented note would matter more than anyone in that room understood yet. I left the hospital 3 days later with my son and a quiet, uneasy feeling that something about Rowan's reaction to the doctor's comment hadn't matched an innocent man's confusion. He'd gone pale. He'd changed the subject fast. And Beatrix, when I mentioned it to her almost accusingly over the phone, had told me to stop reading into a doctor being overly cautious. I didn't stop. I called Marisol that night, exhausted, holding a 2-day-old baby, and told her everything the doctor had said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the sentence that changed the direction of everything that followed. "Odalys, what if this isn't just about money? What if there's something else Beatrix has been protecting for years?" I brought everything I already had. The wire transfers, the shell invoices, the emails about financial pressure as a custody strategy, and that strange line about Rowan's sister situation, to a family law attorney who specialized in contested custody and financial irregularities. I mentioned the doctor's comment almost as an afterthought. My attorney didn't treat it that way. She petitioned the court for disclosure of any medical information directly related to the paternity dispute, along with a forensic accountant's request to trace the shell company invoices. It took weeks. But discovery doesn't ask permission the way a wife does. I remember the day my attorney called about the first batch of records. I was standing in my kitchen, Silas asleep in a carrier against my chest, and I had to sit down on the floor because my legs stopped cooperating. She read through the summary carefully, professionally, the way lawyers do when they know the person on the other end of the line is holding more than just a phone. Once the court ordered disclosure, Rowan voluntarily produced the limited records relevant to the case, and they confirmed what Dr. Reyes had never been able to say directly. 3 years earlier, Rowan had undergone a fertility consultation and been told his chances of conceiving naturally were severely impaired. Not impossible, his specialist had noted, but unlikely without medical intervention he'd never pursued. He never mentioned it to me. Not once, in 2 years of marriage, not during the quiet conversations about someday wanting children, not during the ultrasounds he skipped, not during a single one of the nights I lay awake wondering why he seemed so distant about something I was so afraid and so hopeful about all at once. I thought about every time he'd called my pregnancy unfortunate timing, and I understood for the first time that it might not have been about timing at all. It might have been about a secret he'd been quietly carrying for years, one that made my pregnancy not inconvenient, but impossible to explain away without consequences he wasn't prepared to face. But the deeper discovery came from an unrelated thread my attorney pulled on almost by accident: the mysterious sister mentioned in Beatrix's email. It turned out Rowan wasn't an only child at all. He had an older half-sister quietly written out of the family years earlier after a paternity dispute of her own. One Beatrix had handled the exact same way she was now handling mine: isolate the mother, freeze the money, wait her out. That woman had given up her claim decades ago, worn down and unsupported, exactly the outcome Beatrix was counting on again. It wasn't proof of anything illegal on its own, but it was a pattern laid out in black and white of a family that had done this before and expected to get away with it a second time. To settle the paternity question permanently, my attorney requested a court-ordered DNA test. The results confirmed Rowan was Silas's biological father. Rare, but exactly the kind of case his own specialist had once described as possible against the odds. Which meant the affair rumor Rowan and Beatrix spread, the one that isolated me from every friend I had, wasn't a defense. It was a distraction. They needed people to believe I'd been unfaithful because the alternative truth was far more damaging to them: that Rowan had hidden a serious medical condition for years, and that the divorce, the frozen accounts, the cancelled insurance had all been designed to push me out before Silas was even born. Because here's the piece that mattered most. Beatrix Sorrell's family trust, the one funding Rowan's entire lifestyle, had certain benefits that depended on documented biological succession. Silas being born healthy and confirmed as Rowan's son wasn't unfortunate timing at all. It was the one outcome they'd been quietly trying to prevent, the same way they'd once quietly erased Rowan's half-sister and her child from the family record entirely. Once the DNA results, the medical records, the shell company invoices, and the pattern from Rowan's half-sister's case were all part of the official file, my attorney filed a formal petition disputing Rowan's handling of trust-related assets during the marriage, citing concealment of material information relevant to both the marriage and the custody dispute. The trust's own administrators, unwilling to be pulled into a financial misconduct inquiry themselves, initiated an internal review and voluntarily paused distributions until the court proceedings concluded. Beatrix showed up at my apartment once, uninvited, her composure cracking for the first time since I'd known her. She stood in my doorway in a coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and for a moment I almost didn't recognize her without the practiced smile she always wore in public. She didn't apologize. She offered me money to let this go quietly, the exact same phrase I later learned through the new petition she'd used on Rowan's half-sister years earlier, word for word, like a script she'd simply reused because it had worked once before. She mentioned a figure. It was significant. Enough, she clearly assumed, to make a tired, broke, exhausted new mother disappear the way she'd made someone else disappear a decade earlier. I told her calmly that I didn't want her money. I never had. I told her I'd spent months cleaning offices at midnight and folding hotel linens until my feet bled through my shoes, and not once during any of it had I thought about her family's fortune. What I wanted, I told her, was the truth on record permanently, so no one could ever again tell me I'd manufactured a pregnancy to trap her son, and so no other woman who married into this family would be offered the same quiet, forgettable exit her daughter had once been given. Something in her face changed when I said that. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked less like a woman in control and more like someone watching her own history repeat itself in real time, powerless to stop it. She left without another word, and I never saw her look quite that unsettled again. The final custody and financial ruling took almost a year. It was the longest year of my life, spent nursing a newborn in the early hours while reviewing case updates on my phone, spent sitting in waiting rooms outside my attorney's office with Silas asleep against my chest, During the proceedings, the court ordered temporary supervised visitation for Rowan while the financial misconduct allegations remained under review. A standard precaution given the ongoing financial misconduct inquiry tied to shared finances. There was no dramatic reveal in a courtroom, no moment where anyone gasped or wept on cue. Just documents, timelines, and a paper trail too consistent to argue with, read aloud in flat, procedural language by people who had no idea how much it had cost me to gather it. I remember sitting in that courtroom watching Rowan's attorney flip through pages of evidence that represented 18-hour shifts, sleepless nights, and a $200 consultation with Marisol's cousin, a paralegal who'd shown me for free how to properly organize a financial timeline for discovery. The court ultimately ruled that the trust's succession funds be redirected into a legally protected account for Silas's future, managed independently of both Rowan and Beatrix, untouchable until he came of age. Rowan was also ordered to cover retroactive medical and living expenses for the entire pregnancy, the exact cost he'd once called, not his responsibility, paid now in structured monthly installments enforced by the same court that had once seen me as nothing more than an inconvenient complication. Separately, my attorney helped Rowan's half-sister file a new civil petition after the newly discovered evidence came to light, giving a woman I'd never met the paperwork to finally ask the questions she'd been too exhausted and too alone to ask years earlier. I still see Rowan occasionally at scheduled visitation, now unsupervised after the case closed. Beatrix, I haven't spoken to since that afternoon in my apartment. I heard, through the same social circle that once turned their backs on me, that she blames everyone but herself for how things unfolded, and that her daughter's new petition has cost her more sleep than the custody ruling ever did. Silas is too now. He has my mother's eyes and a manageable, well-monitored condition that specialists check twice a year. Nothing more, nothing less. He runs through my apartment in socks that never stay on his feet, and some mornings I stand in the doorway of his room just to watch him sleep, still not fully believing how close I came to raising him completely alone in every sense of the word. Every specialist visit is a quiet reminder that the very thing meant to make me look like a liar ended up being the thing that protected both of us. Marisol still calls every week, usually on Sunday nights, and every week I remind myself how differently this could have ended without one person who refused to disappear when everyone else did. I've since paid it forward twice. Once for a coworker going through her own quiet divorce, and once for a stranger in an online support group who reminded me so much of myself at my lowest that I couldn't not reach out. I think about that morning often. The exhaustion, the fear, the total aloneness of driving myself to a hospital while the people who should have shown up chose silence instead. I think about Dr. Reyes too and how much restraint it must have taken to say almost nothing while clearly knowing something enormous. Because doing his job right meant letting the truth surface through the proper channels, not through him. I ran into him once months later at a pharmacy of all places, and he simply asked how Silas was doing, nothing more, the same careful professionalism intact even outside those hospital walls. And I think more than I expected to about a woman I never met, Rowan's half-sister, who went through this exact same silence a decade before I did, with no one left to document it for her, no Marisol, no filing box, no folder hidden beneath a false bottom. I think about how easily her story could have simply disappeared, the way Beatrix intended, if a stray line in an email hadn't given it a second chance to be heard. Being abandoned when you need someone most doesn't mean you're powerless. Sometimes the very thing people try to use against you is the thing that ends up protecting you completely, and sometimes the truth you uncover for yourself ends up protecting someone else's story too. If you were in my position, no support, no money, and a truth buried by 2 generations of the same family, how far would you have gone to bring it into the light?